Hello everyone, welcome to Marco's BL Love. Please enjoy this video.
His hand moved without thinking, just reaching for the glass on the shelf above me, nothing more than that. But my body did not wait to understand. My shoulders curled inward, my arms came up to cover my face. The flinch happened before I could stop it, before I could remind myself that this man had never once hurt me, before I could remind myself that it had been 2 years since I left the one who had. When I finally opened my eyes, Riven was not standing above me. He was on his knees on the kitchen floor. His black hair fell forward. His voice, when it came, was the quietest thing I had ever heard. Never. Not me. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. My name is Ren, and I want to tell you something I have never told anyone outside the 4 walls of a therapist's office. For most of my life, I did not know that love was supposed to feel safe. I did not know that an alpha raising his hand near you was supposed to be neutral, just a gesture, just a movement in space with no meaning attached. For 3 years, a raised hand meant pain was coming. A raised voice meant I needed to make myself smaller. A slammed door meant I needed to disappear before the anger found something to land on. I learned to read every shift in Dorian Vale's posture the way a sailor reads weather, and long after I stopped being his husband, my body kept reading the air around me, kept flinching at shadows, kept bracing for a blow that no longer came. But I am getting ahead of myself. You deserve to understand how I got here, how a man with a good heart and a hopeful soul ended up curled against a shop counter in a city he had rebuilt himself in, asking whether he would ever feel safe inside his own skin again. You deserve to understand all of it, because the beginning is where every wound starts, and wounds do not close until they are seen clearly in the light. I was 24 years old when Dorian Vale walked into the graduate student art show, where I was exhibiting a series of botanical watercolors. I had blonde hair, then the same as now, though I wore it longer in those days. I was dressed in something cheap and pressed and hopeful the way young people dress when they want to be taken seriously. Dorian was 31, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of composed stillness that reads as strength before you understand it is something else entirely. He stood in front of one of my paintings for a long time without speaking. When he finally turned to look at me, his expression was unguarded in a way that felt honest. I did not know yet that Dorian was an exceptionally skilled performer of honesty. He said the painting reminded him of something his mother used to grow in the garden of the house where he was raised before she died and his father sold the property. He said it so simply, with so little bid for sympathy, that I believed him immediately. That was the first thing I understood about Dorian Vale. He knew precisely which truths to share in order to open a door, and which darker truths to keep behind the wall. We talked for 2 hours that evening. He bought the painting. He asked for my number. He texted that same night, a photograph of the painting propped against the wall of what turned out to be an enormous apartment overlooking the harbor. "It looks right here," he said, "like it belongs." I thought he meant the painting. The courtship was careful and measured. He remembered small details, the tea I preferred, the way I liked museum exhibits at off-peak hours when the rooms were quiet enough to think, the fact that I always ordered my eggs without the whites because the texture bothered me. I mistook this for attentiveness. I did not yet understand that the same quality of attention that feels like devotion in the beginning is the architecture of control in the end. He was cataloging my preferences, not to honor them, but to own them. He proposed 9 months after we met, at the botanical garden where we had spent our 3rd date, in front of a greenhouse full of orchids. He got down on one knee. He cried. I cried harder. I said yes without hesitation, because everything inside me had been organized by his careful hands into a shape that could only answer yes. We were bonded 6 months later in a small ceremony. His family attended with reserved politeness. My own family was small, just my older brother Stellan and my grandmother Morel, both of whom clapped and wept with appropriate happiness. Stellan pulled me aside before the reception began and said quietly, "Make sure he makes you happy, little one." I told him Dorian made me happier than anyone ever had. I believed it completely at the time. The change came gradually, the way water rises, so slowly that by the time you feel it at your chin, you cannot remember how you arrived there. The first change was the voice, a tone that arrived without warning in the middle of ordinary conversations, cold and precise, like a blade drawn and held very still. "You embarrassed me at the dinner last night," he would say, the morning after an evening where I had laughed too loudly or talked too enthusiastically. "You do not think before you speak. You need to think." I apologized. I told myself he was right. I told myself I was still learning how to be the partner of someone like Dorian Vale, a man who moved in professional circles where composure mattered and impressions were currency. I adjusted. I learned to calibrate my volume, to monitor my expressions, to make myself appropriately unremarkable at every social gathering. And every time I managed it successfully, Dorian would press a kiss to my forehead in the car on the way home and say, "Much better tonight." The relief of that approval was like oxygen after holding my breath too long. The control spread after that, the way frost spreads across a window. He wanted to know where I was at every hour. He disapproved of my friendship with a fellow Omega named Tobias, who had known me since childhood. "He is always filling your head with nonsense," Dorian said. "You are different when you have been around him." I pulled back from Tobias, slowly, apologetically, full of reasons that felt reasonable at the time and look hollow now. He disapproved of my career as a freelance illustrator and arranged an administrative role for me at his company instead, something that required my full days and left little room for anything that belonged to me. I accepted it because I had learned by then that refusal came at a cost I could not always afford. The first time he hit me, we had been bonded for 14 months. It was a small thing, a scheduling misunderstanding, and what it produced was not a conversation, but something else entirely. His palm connected with the side of my face with a flat, decisive sound that I will hear in certain quiet moments for the rest of my life. The silence afterward was worse than the blow. "I am sorry," he said. "That was wrong. You pushed me there, but I should not have done that." And I held both halves of those words, the apology and the blame stitched into its center, because holding them meant the marriage was still something I could understand. He was gentle for weeks afterward. The flowers were extravagant. The dinners were careful. I rebuilt myself around the gentleness and told myself the other thing had been an aberration, something that would not happen again if I was more attentive, more thoughtful, less scattered. It happened again 4 months later, and again 5 months after that. The pattern revealed itself slowly but completely, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, one feature at a time until the image is undeniable. The blows were calibrated, always to places that clothing covered, always followed by softness and then an explanation of what I had done to provoke it. I began to live in a constant state of managing the variables, thinking always about what I could do differently to prevent the next one. I was 27 years old when I discovered I was pregnant. I told Dorian carefully, at the right time of day, in the right tone. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he supposed it changed the timeline of things. Saurin was born on a Thursday in late November, small and loud and blond as new wheat. His eyes were the pale silver blue of a winter morning, and they were nobody's I recognized. He was entirely his own person from the first hour. He wrapped his small fist around my finger, and I understood for the first time in years what it felt like to have something in my life that was solely mine, something no one could reach through me to damage. The months after Saurin's birth were quieter than I had expected. Perhaps the new shape of our household distracted Dorian, or perhaps he recognized that something in me had shifted, some layer of protectiveness that would not tolerate what I had tolerated when it was only my own body absorbing the cost. Either way, the violence stayed dormant for 8 months. Long enough that I allowed myself a fragile optimism. Long enough to be truly dangerous when it returned. It returned on a weeknight when Saurin was asleep in his crib, and I had found, on Dorian's phone, a thread of messages that rewrote 18 months of history in the time it took me to read 2 screens. His name was Finn, and from the messages it was clear that what they shared had begun before our bonding ceremony and had never stopped. The messages were affectionate in a way that Dorian had not been with me in 2 years. They planned trips together. They had private jokes. There were photographs. I put the phone down on the counter very carefully. My hands were steady. The steadiness surprised me, but I think some part of me had been waiting for this. Some part of me had known there was a piece of the architecture I had not yet found, and now that I had found it, the whole structure made a horrible, complete sense. Dorian came home 20 minutes later. He saw his phone on the counter. He saw my face. He moved toward me with the calm, measured step that preceded the explanation that would make the thing I had seen become something other than what it was. I did not wait for the explanation. I said his name once, and I said that I had seen the messages. I said I knew about Finn. He told me, in a voice as level as a lecture, that what I had found was none of my concern. He told me that an Omega in my position should understand the realities of how men like him lived. He told me that my function in this household had always been clear, and that my failing to appreciate the limits of that function was a failure of intelligence. He told me that I was fortunate to have what I had, and that if I could not manage my small responsibilities without creating scenes, perhaps those responsibilities needed to be reconsidered. He meant Saurin. I understood it immediately. He said it knowing exactly what it would do to me, knowing that every other threat he had ever made would become insignificant in the face of that one, that I would fold rather than give him an excuse to exercise whatever power he believed he had over my child. And I did fold. In that moment, I folded. I went to bed. I did not cry until I heard his breathing settle into sleep beside me, and even then I cried without sound, the way I had learned to do everything I needed to do without drawing attention. But something had changed underneath the folding. Something had gone quiet and hard and certain, like a river freezing from the surface down. I had one person left in my life who was mine, and not his. Tobias, who I had pulled away from years earlier, who had sent me a birthday message every year regardless, who had never asked for an explanation, and had simply waited. I sent him 4 words from a borrowed phone the next morning. I need your help. Tobias was there within the hour. He looked at me for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "Okay, tell me what you need." It took 4 weeks to arrange. Tobias's sister Ren lived in Cairo, a city 200 kilometers away, in a neighborhood Dorian had no reason to know and no connections within. She had a small apartment with a 2nd bedroom, offered without conditions. Tobias assembled funds carefully over those 4 weeks, nothing traceable. He found the name of an attorney in Cairo who specialized in exactly this kind of case. He did all of this without once making me feel like a burden, and I have not found adequate words to thank him for it in the years since. On a Wednesday morning, while Dorian was at a conference, I packed 1 bag. Saurin's essentials, a change of clothes for each of us, my grandmother Morel's ring, from the silk pouch at the back of a drawer where Dorian never went, and our identification documents. I did not take anything that had been given to me during the marriage. I did not want any of it. I wanted to leave with only what I had come with. I held Saurin on my hip while I locked the apartment door behind me for the last time. He was awake and curious, looking around with that open and interested expression he had, the one that saw everything and judged nothing. I whispered to him, "We are going somewhere new, baby." He put his small hand flat against my cheek and looked at me with those pale blue eyes and said, "Okay, Daddy." We took the train. I looked at Saurin rather than out the window as the city receded. He fell asleep against my shoulder with one fist curled against his chin, and I counted his breaths the way I had counted them on the hardest nights in that apartment, using the rhythm of them as a metronome to keep myself from drowning. Cairo was gray and raining when we arrived. Ren met us at the station under an enormous yellow umbrella. She hugged me without asking any questions, and she smelled like coffee and wool and something clean. She drove us to the apartment, which was warm and a little cluttered and full of houseplants. She had put a small cot in the corner with a stuffed rabbit on the pillow. Saurin spotted the rabbit immediately and reached for it with both hands. She laughed and said, "It is yours, sweetheart. Keep it." That night, after Saurin was sleeping with the rabbit tucked under his arm, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, and the silence of a place where no one would come through the door without my permission and I wept for a long time. Not for Dorian, not for the marriage or the life I had believed I was building. I wept for the version of myself who had stood in that botanical garden and said yes without hesitation, who had believed so completely and been so completely wrong, who had spent 3 years making himself smaller and quieter and more careful, and still had not managed to make it safe. And then I dried my face, and I began. The bond dissolution took 11 months, and during that time I found work at a small florist's shop 2 streets from Ren's apartment. The owner, Casper, was 62 and had been running the shop since before I was born. He did not ask many questions. He showed me how to condition stems and manage cold room inventory, and I learned quickly, because I had nothing to do with my mind except learn and take care of Saurin and not fall apart. Saurin sat on a wooden stool in the workroom on the mornings he stayed home and watched the flowers with the enormous and solemn attention he gave to everything he found worthy of study. The dissolution came through on a Tuesday in February. I was conditioning peonies when my attorney called. She said congratulations, and I said thank you, and then I set down the peonies and stood very still for 2 full minutes, with my hand pressed flat against the workbench, breathing slowly. Casper appeared in the doorway, looked at my face, said nothing, and went to make tea. A year later, I used part of the settlement to open Ren and Wild, a small combination flower shop and tea room on a narrow street in the older part of Caro's Market District. I named it Ren and Wild because Ren was the name of the woman who had opened her apartment to us without conditions, and Wild because that was what I was trying to remember how to be, something that had not been shaped entirely by someone else's hands. Saurin stood behind the counter on opening morning and gravely handed each customer a small paper card he had decorated with crayon flowers the evening before. He was 3.5 and already understood that this place was ours, and that ours meant something. 2 years passed. I will not tell you they were easy, because they were not. Healing is not a straight line, and it is not a quiet process. There were nights I could not sleep because the darkness felt like a held breath. There were panic responses in ordinary moments, a stranger raising his voice on the street, a car backfiring, a door slammed somewhere in the building above my apartment. My body carried the record of everything it had learned, and it did not simply erase that record because I had left the source. I saw a therapist named Dr. Moray twice a week for the first year, and once a week for the second. He had a calm voice and a small office above a bookshop, and he never pushed me toward conclusions I had not reached on my own. He used a phrase once that stayed with me. He said, "The nervous system is loyal. It protects you using the best information it has. Your work now is to give it new information, to show it that the new environment is different from the old one. New information." I thought about that often while I stood in the shop conditioning stems, trimming leaves, arranging the cold room. I thought about it while I walked Saurin to nursery school in the mornings, his hand in mine, and his small voice narrating everything he saw with the inexhaustible attention of a 4-year-old who had decided the world was primarily interesting. I thought about it on the evenings I sat alone after Saurin was asleep, with a cup of tea and the sounds of the street coming up through the old building's windows, letting myself feel the ordinary quiet without flinching, which was its own kind of practice. Riven Ashford walked into Ren and Wild for the first time on a Thursday in October, 9 months before everything I have told you would reach its defining moment. He was tall, black-haired, the kind of deep black that holds blue when light catches it at certain angles. He wore a dark coat that had been expensive once, and was now slightly worn at the left cuff in a way that suggested he had not noticed. He looked around the shop with brief and efficient attention, and then his gaze settled on the arrangement in the front window, which I had spent Wednesday morning composing, dahlias and Japanese anemone and trailing eucalyptus against a base of dark moss. He stopped looking at the rest of the room. I waited behind the counter. He stood at the window longer than most people stand at anything. Then he came to the counter and said, "The arrangement in the window. I need something similar, but for a larger space, a conference room. I want it to feel like that, but in a slightly more serious register, less moss." I asked him about the dimensions of the space, the lighting, whether the arrangement would be seen from a distance or from close range. He answered with precision, He knew what he was looking at. We discussed it for 15 minutes, and I suggested something with deeper tones and a more architectural structure. Dark anemone and black-stemmed rice flower and silver sage that would read from across a large room without losing detail up close. He said yes, immediately. He came back the following Thursday for a second arrangement, and the Thursday after that. On the fourth visit, he said, "I have been thinking about a standing order, weekly arrangements for the reception and the conference room." On his way out that day, he paused and said, "I also prefer to come in person to discuss variations rather than communicate by message. I hope that is acceptable." I said that was fine. He came every Thursday after that. Sometimes he came on other days when a client event required something larger than the standing arrangement. He always came in person. He always discussed the composition in specific detail. He had a thoughtful eye and a way of asking questions that suggested he was genuinely interested in the answers rather than performing interest as social courtesy. After the sixth visit, I asked whether he had a background in design. He said no, but that his mother had had a garden and had spent years trying to teach him why one composition worked and another did not. He said he had not fully understood her lessons until after she was gone. He said it the way Dorian had once said something similar about his mother, and something in me braced at the similarity. But then I watched Riven's face while he spoke, and what was there was simply grief, clean and unperformed, not deployed for effect. He was not sharing the thing to open a door. He was sharing it because I had asked and he had answered honestly. The difference was recognizable once I understood what I was looking for. He asked nothing personal about me for a long time. He came, he discussed flowers, he paid, he left. He was unfailingly polite and impersonally pleasant, and I began to relax around him the way you relax around a large, calm presence that shows no interest in making demands. And then, on the 9th Thursday, Saurin came to work with me, because his school had an in-service day, and when Riven arrived at his usual time, he found Saurin sitting on the counter beside the register, eating an apple with great concentration. Riven stopped when he saw him. He looked at Saurin with the expression I had begun to learn on his face, the one that meant he was paying genuine attention rather than performing it. Saurin looked back at him with the steady and assessing gaze he gave to anything he had not yet categorized. Then Saurin said, "You are the man who comes on Thursdays." Riven said, "That is right, and you must be the one who makes the cards." Saurin sat up straighter. He had stopped making cards months earlier, but clearly felt no need to share this correction. He said, "I am Saurin." Riven said, "I am Riven." He did not make it a production. He did not perform warmth at a child to impress an audience. He answered the information offered with information in kind, and then turned to me, naturally, and said, "I was thinking about the next arrangement. I want something with a little more warmth. We have been using quite a few dark tones, and the room may be ready for something slightly lighter." We discussed the arrangement. Riven paid. On his way out, he paused and said to Saurin, "It was nice to meet you." Saurin considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a significant decision. Then he said, "You can come back." Riven's mouth did something brief that was almost a smile. That was the beginning of something, though I did not recognize it as such for several more weeks. By December, Riven's Thursday visits had expanded slightly. There were coffees from the shop on the corner that he began bringing for both of us, without asking, after the third time it had come up naturally in conversation. There were exchanges that extended past the flowers. He listened the way he looked at flower arrangements, with specific and unhurried attention. I noticed that he moved carefully around me, not awkwardly, not with the stiffness of someone performing consideration. But he always left space. He asked before he moved behind the counter on the one occasion he offered to help with a large delivery. He announced his movements when he shifted around me in the workroom. He never stood too close, or too suddenly. It was consistent in the way a deliberately chosen quality is consistent, something maintained through awareness rather than accident. "Doctor," Moray's phrase came back to me often during those months. New information. Here was a person who moved through space without menace, who listened without collecting data for later use, who showed up on schedule and asked nothing that was not freely given. My nervous system received this week by week, and began to register something unfamiliar. Not comfort, not yet, but the absence of alarm. And the absence of alarm after years of continuous alarm felt like something close to rest. It was a Thursday in January, gray and raining, when Saurin was with me, because he had a slight cold, and I had kept him home from school. He was curled on the small sofa in the back room, with a blanket and the stuffed rabbit. Riven arrived at the usual time. He noticed Saurin's absence from the counter and glanced toward the back room without asking. I said, "He has a cold." Riven said nothing, but on his way out he paused at the door and said, "Tell him to rest well." That was it. Tell him to rest well. I stood in the shop after Riven left and held that sentence the way you hold something small and unexpectedly warm. And I thought, with a clarity that almost startled me, this man is kind. Not performed kindness, not strategic kindness deployed in service of something else. The ordinary kind that does not know it is being noticed, which is rarer than it should be, and which I had forgotten how to receive without searching it for a hidden cost. A week later, on a Tuesday, I was working late conditioning a large delivery of ranunculus. Saurin was at Ren's apartment for a rare overnight, and I was alone in the shop with the slow grounding rhythm of the work. Riven came in at 6:30 without sending a message ahead. He was in a dark suit, and his black hair was slightly disordered. He stopped when he saw me and said, "The door was unlocked." I said, "I know. I forget sometimes." He looked tired. Not the tired of a long day, but the tired of something that does not resolve with sleep. I said, "Do you want a cup of tea?" He said yes. He sat on Saurin's stool while I made tea in the back kitchen. We sat in the quiet shop with rain on the street outside and flowers all around us, and neither of us spoke, and it was not uncomfortable. It was simply quiet. At some point in the middle of that hour, it occurred to me that I was not afraid of anything in this room, that I was sitting with a large and powerful alpha, and I was not monitoring the distance between us, or calibrating my voice, or preparing for a shift in the air. I was just sitting with someone whose company I had come to value, drinking tea in a warm space while rain fell outside. I locked the shop at 7:30. Riven walked me to the corner of my street, though his car was parked in the other direction, and said good night with a formality that was warmer than it sounded. I walked the remaining 2 minutes to my building, with something unfamiliar moving through me, slow and careful, like a plant deciding whether the soil is right before it puts down roots. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, with weak winter light coming through the shop windows, I was rearranging the storage shelving in the back workroom. Riven had offered to help when he arrived and overheard me muttering about the inefficient layout, equipment sliding to the front. He was holding the left side of the unit steady while I reorganized the right, and we had been working together for 20 minutes in the comfortable way that had become ordinary between us. He reached up for a glass measure I had placed on the upper shelf, needing it to shift the arrangement above. His hand moved up and over my shoulder without warning, and my body did what my body had learned to do over 3 years of being someone's target. My shoulders curled inward. My arms came up to cover my face. The flinch happened before I could stop it, before I could remind myself that this man had never once hurt me, before I could remind myself that it had been 2 years since I left the one who had. Later, if I ever tried to describe what happened in the moment that followed, the only words that came close to honest were the plainest ones. The Omega flinched when the Alpha raised his hand. He froze, knelt, and said, "Never. Not me." That is what happened. That is exactly what happened. Riven's hand stopped mid-reach. His whole body went completely still, the way a person goes still when they have understood something significant and are giving themselves a moment to respond to it correctly rather than just quickly. He did not speak. He did not reach further. He stood frozen for the span of 3 full breaths, and then slowly, with the kind of deliberate care that is nothing like awkwardness and everything like intention, he lowered himself to the floor. Not crouching, not one knee like an apology or a performance. Both knees on the cold workroom floor, his black hair falling forward, his large hands open and flat on his thighs, his eyes on the space between us rather than on my face, because he had understood without anyone telling him that direct intensity would be the wrong thing in this moment. He said it quietly. Never. Not me. He stayed on the floor. He did not reach for me. He did not rush to fill the silence with reassurances or questions or a demonstration of how safe he was. He knelt with his hands still, and he looked at the floor between us, and he waited. I stood with my back against the shelving, and my heart hammering, and my arms still half raised from a reflex that had exposed me, which was what the old voice in my head called it immediately, which said I should apologize right now, should explain, should make it smaller and more comfortable for him. But the newer voice, the one I had been building in Dr. Moray's office and in the slow rhythm of the flower shop, and in the months of ordinary quiet in my own apartment, said something else. That voice said, look at what he did with that information. Look at where he is, and what he chose. He had gone to his knees. Not to minimize himself as a strategy, not to perform safety as a tactic, but because something in him had understood in that frozen instant exactly what I needed, and his body had moved toward that understanding before his mind had finished processing it. The floor, the lowered eyeline, the open hands, the waiting without demanding. He said it again, even more quietly than the first time. Not me, Cale. Never. I lowered my arms. My hands were trembling, and I was not going to pretend they were not. I looked at him on the floor of my shop, this man who came every Thursday and brought coffee and listened without collecting anything for later use, who told my son to rest well when he was sick, who had sat with me in a rain-dark shop for an hour without needing anything from me in return. And I breathed in the smell of ranunculus and cold rain and the faint cedar that always came with him, and something in me that had been braced for a very long time released, just a fraction, just the smallest give, the way a door yields when the wind changes direction. I said, I know it is not you. He nodded once. He stayed exactly where he was until I moved first, until I reached past him and took the glass from the shelf myself and set it on the workbench and turned back to the arrangement. And then he stood, carefully, and came to stand beside me at his usual distance, and said in his usual voice, I think the anemone should go further to the left. We finished the arrangement together. We did not talk about what had happened, not then, but it was there between us now, present and named in the only way that mattered, in the particular language of what he had chosen to do when the choice was in front of him. He had chosen the floor. He had chosen to make himself low so I could feel large enough to stay in the room. That is not a small thing to choose. I had spent 3 years with a man who had never, not once, chosen to make himself smaller, so I could breathe. And Riven Ashford, who owed me nothing, who had come into a flower shop on a Thursday to buy arrangements for a conference room, had gone to his knees on a cold floor without hesitation and without need of an audience, and said, never, not me. I did not fall in love with him in that moment. But something began in that moment that was going in that direction, carefully, with its eyes open, checking the ground for firmness before each step. And that, for a man who had learned the hardest possible way what it means to run towards something without looking, felt like exactly the right pace to move. What I did not know yet was that Riven Ashford carried his own history, his own reasons for understanding what it meant to choose the floor. I did not know that his past was about to intersect with mine in a way neither of us had seen coming. I did not know that Dorian Vale, a man I had left 2 years ago in a city 200 kilometers away, had not stopped watching, had not stopped building a case for why I owed him something, had not stopped believing that what was his remained his, regardless of what I had signed or fled. And I did not know that in less than a month, the careful and quiet life I had built would be tested in ways that would require everything I had become to survive. But that evening, after I closed the shop and walked home through streets still wet with the day's rain, I pressed my hand to Saurin's bedroom door and listened to the soft sound of his breathing in the dark. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not yet. Something quieter and more foundational than happiness. The first real stirring of the belief that safety was something that could exist in the same place as love. That those two things were not, in fact, contradictions. That a man could raise his hand near you, and the answer could be nothing at all. Just a gesture. Just a movement in space. Just a man reaching for a glass who, the moment he understood what his movement had done, went to his knees without hesitation and said the truest possible thing. Never. Not me. Conti. 3 days passed after the workroom. 3 ordinary days of conditioning stems and making change and writing orders in the ledger and walking Saurin to school and back. And during all 3 of those days, I turned what had happened over in my mind with the careful and slightly obsessive attention I gave to anything I had not yet fully understood. Riven had gone to his knees. He had stayed there. He had not asked a single question. I had spent a significant portion of my therapy sessions with Dr. Moray discussing the mechanics of trust, specifically why rebuilding it after sustained damage was not a matter of deciding to trust, but a matter of accumulating evidence, small, reliable data points gathered over time until the weight of them tipped the scale. Dr. Moray was careful about this. He never told me to trust anyone. He told me to notice what people did when the cost of doing the right thing was invisible, when no one was grading them and no advantage was attached. That, he said, is where you find out who someone actually is. Riven had been given a piece of information about me that I had not intended to share. He had not used it to ask questions. He had not used it to position himself as my protector in a way that required my gratitude. He had not said anything that needed a response from me, had not created a moment that I had to manage on top of already managing my own body's betrayal. He had made himself small and still and available, and had waited for me to decide what to do next. And when I moved first and reached for the glass and turned back to the arrangement, he had simply joined me there and talked about anemone placement. That, according to the framework Dr. Moray had given me, was who Riven Ashford actually was. I was thinking about this on the 4th morning after the workroom, when the shop door opened and Riven came in on a day that was not Thursday. He was in a lighter coat than usual, which meant the temperature had shifted overnight, and he was carrying 2 coffees from the corner shop and a paper bag that turned out to contain almond croissants, still warm enough to steam when he set them on the counter. He said, "I was passing." Then he said nothing else, and simply placed one of the coffees in front of me and took his usual position at the other side of the counter. I said, "It is Tuesday." He said, "I know." I said, "You usually come Thursday." He said, "Yes." I looked at him for a moment. He looked back at me with that particular expression I had learned to read, the one that contained more information than the surface of it suggested, and I understood that this was not a passing, this was a checking in. This was someone who had been given information about the state of another person, and had decided, without requiring anything in exchange, to show up 3 days later with coffee and almond croissants to confirm that the other person was still standing. I took the coffee. I said, "Thank you." He nodded once, and we stood on opposite sides of the counter, and drank our coffee, and I told him about a new delivery of late-season dahlias I had sourced from a grower 2 hours north of the city, and he listened with his full attention the way he always did, and the morning light came through the shop windows and lay across the counter between us, and it was, in its quiet and specific way, one of the nicest mornings I had spent in a very long time. He left after 40 minutes. At the door he paused, which was his habit when he had something he was deciding whether to say. He said, "Cale, I want you to know that the other day does not change anything about the way I see you. I just want you to know that." Then he left, and I stood in the shop with the remaining warmth of the coffee cup against my hands, and something expanding slowly in my chest, like a room being opened after a long time closed. The following Thursday, he came as usual with the standing order and a new request for a smaller arrangement for his personal office, something that would survive without much attention, he said, since he was not always there during the day. I asked what colors he preferred for a personal space rather than a professional one. He thought about it longer than most people think about that question. He said something with white in it, but not cold white, warm white, and some green. I thought of ranunculus and lily of the valley and trailing ivy, and I built it that afternoon after he left and set it aside for him to collect. He came back at closing time to collect it. He looked at it for a long moment, holding it in both hands, the way you hold something you are taking seriously, and he said, "This is exactly right." It was such a simple thing to say, and he said it with such complete sincerity that I had to look down at the counter to hide whatever was happening on my face. That evening, I told Saurin, over dinner of soup and bread and a shared pot of chamomile tea, because Saurin had decided chamomile tea was appropriate for evening meals, and I had long since stopped questioning it, that Riven had asked for a personal arrangement. Saurin received this information with the gravity of a general receiving battlefield intelligence. He said, "The man who comes on Thursdays." I said, "Yes." Saurin considered this for a full minute while he ate his soup. Then he said, "He is good." I said, "Yes, I think so." Saurin nodded, which in his system of approval meant the matter was settled, and returned to his soup. I lay awake that night for a while, not with anxiety, which was how I had spent most of my wakeful nights for the past 2 years, but with the strange and slightly uncomfortable sensation of feeling something I had told myself I was not ready to feel. Wanting. Not the desperate need of someone who has been starved, not the reflexive attachment of someone who has learned to bond quickly out of fear of being alone, but something quieter and more considered than either of those, a specific and honest wanting directed at a specific and honest person. Riven Ashford, who came every Thursday and sometimes on Tuesdays, who went to his knees without being asked, who said, "This is exactly right," like he meant it entirely. I was not going to rush toward it, but I was going to stop pretending it was not there. 2 weeks after the workroom, Riven asked if he could take Saurin to the park near the market on a Saturday morning, while I received a large delivery that would require most of my attention. He asked this directly, without any apparent agenda beyond the practical, and he asked me rather than asking Saurin first, which I noticed and appreciated. He said, "I realize it is a significant thing to ask. If you would prefer not, I understand completely." I thought about it for a day. I called Tobias that evening, which was not something I did to get permission, but something I did when I wanted to think out loud with someone who knew my whole history and would tell me the truth. Tobias listened. Then he said, "What does your gut say? Not your old gut, your new one." I said, "My new gut says Riven Ashford does not know how to be anything other than what he is, and what he is appears to be genuinely decent." Tobias said, "Then take the data point." Saturday morning, Riven arrived at 8. He stood in the doorway of the flat above the shop, which I used as our home, and waited until I invited him in, rather than coming in when the door opened. He crouched to Saurin's level when Saurin appeared from the kitchen still holding a piece of toast, and he said, "Good morning. I am here to take you to the park, if that sounds all right to you." Saurin assessed him with his usual thoroughness, and then said, "I need to put on my coat," and then said, "Do you like ducks?" Riven said, "I have a complicated relationship with ducks, but I am willing to revisit it." Saurin found this extremely satisfactory. They were gone for 2 hours. The delivery arrived, was sorted and stored, and I had everything conditioned and arranged in the cold room by the time I heard Saurin's voice coming up the stairs. He was describing, at length, and with considerable technical accuracy, the behavior of the largest duck at the central pond. Riven was listening. I could tell from the cadence of his responses that he was actually listening, not tolerating, and something about hearing that particular sound, those 2 voices in the stairwell, the small one and the deep one, filled in a shape inside me that I had not known was hollow. Saurin reported at lunch that Riven had let him lead the entire walk, which meant Saurin had narrated the route and made all decisions about direction and pace, and that Riven had made no attempt to redirect or correct. He said, "He listened to everything I said." He said this the way a 4-year-old says something that has mattered to them, simply and without performance. He listened to everything I said. I looked down at my soup. That afternoon, alone in the cold room, rearranging a delivery that did not need rearranging, I had a quiet and thorough cry that was not at all about sadness. It was about how long it had taken me to understand that someone listening to everything Saurin said should not feel exceptional. It should be ordinary. It should be baseline. And yet, here I was, undone by it completely, because I had spent long enough in a world where the ordinary and the exceptional had been so badly rearranged that I no longer knew which end was up. I did know one thing clearly. I was going to allow this, whatever this was, and wherever it went. I was going to stop holding myself apart from it, out of an abundance of caution that had outlived its usefulness. My nervous system had received enough new information. It was time to act on it. On the Thursday, 2 weeks after the park, I was the one who paused at the door when Riven was leaving. He stopped and turned, the way he always did. I said, "There's a restaurant I have been wanting to go to, a small place in the old quarter, and I think it would be better with company, if you are interested." I said it to the middle distance rather than directly to him because I was brave, but not quite that brave yet. I felt, rather than saw, the change in the air between us. He said, "Yes, I am interested. Tell me when." We went on a Wednesday, which was Ren's evening to have Saurin, because she collected him every other Wednesday for what she called grandmother dinner, even though she was not his grandmother and was not significantly older than me, which was a complaint I had given up raising. The restaurant was exactly what I had hoped, small and warmly lit, and not the kind of place that required performance, with mismatched chairs and a menu written on a chalkboard, and wine served in glasses that were slightly too large. We sat at a table near the window and ordered and talked for 3 hours. I learned things about Riven Ashford that I had not known from Thursdays alone. He had built his consulting firm over 6 years from nothing, starting with one client in a room the size of the shop's cold room, which he described without pride or false modesty, simply as a fact. He had a younger brother named Cole, who lived on the other side of the country, and who Riven called every Sunday without fail. He had not been in a relationship for 4 years, which he offered without explanation, and I did not ask for one. He ran in the mornings, not because he enjoyed it particularly, but because it was the most efficient way he had found to quiet the noise in his head before the day started. He had the same complicated relationship with silence that I had, the sense that it was necessary, and that filling it unnecessarily was a kind of dishonesty. He asked about Saurin's father once, carefully, after we had been talking for 2 hours, and were on the second glass of wine. He said, "I know it is not my business." He said, "I only ask because Saurin speaks of you as the only parent." He said, "You do not need to answer." I told him in 2 sentences. Saurin's father and I were bonded. It did not work out. He nodded. He asked nothing further. He did not press for the shape of the damage or the name of the person who had caused it. He received the 2 sentences and placed them somewhere that I understood was a private archive, not a store of ammunition. We walked back through the old quarter after, through streets of old stone and amber streetlight, and it was cold enough that our breath was visible in the air between us. At the corner where our routes diverged, he stopped and looked at me for a moment with that serious attention, and then said, "I want to see you again, not for flowers. I mean, I still want the flowers." He paused. "But I mean outside this arrangement. I would like to continue this." I said, "So would I." He said, "Good." And he did not reach for me, did not take my hand or lean toward me in any way that required me to respond in kind. He simply said good and looked at me for one more moment, and then turned and walked down the street in the other direction, and I stood on the corner for a few seconds in the cold, dark air, feeling something that I finally allowed myself to recognize correctly. Happy. I felt happy. It was not complicated or qualified or braced against its own ending. It was simply happy, standing on a corner in the cold, watching a black-haired alpha walk away from me and knowing he would come back. That was the last quiet week. On the following Monday, I was opening the shop at 7:30 when I found an envelope tucked under the door. No stamp, no postmark. My name on the front in handwriting I would have recognized on the surface of the moon. Dorian's handwriting, small and precise, and absolutely controlled in the way everything about Dorian Vale was controlled. I stood in the doorway of the shop for a long moment with the envelope in my hand, and the early morning street behind me, and the smell of the cold room and the flowers on the other side of the door, and I made a deliberate choice to breathe before I opened it. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said that Dorian had been following the progress of my life in Cairo with interest, which was the kind of sentence designed to remind me that his reach was longer than the distance I had put between us. The second paragraph said that he had recently been speaking to the family court mediator regarding the bond dissolution terms, and had reason to believe that certain aspects of the settlement related to Saurin's custodial situation had been incorrectly finalized, and that he intended to pursue a review. He said he was sharing this information as a courtesy. He said he hoped I was well. I read it twice. My hands were entirely steady, which surprised me until I understood that this was not the surprise it should have been, that some part of me had been waiting for exactly this, that the other shoe had never fully landed when I walked out of that apartment 2 years ago, and that some quiet and watchful part of me had been listening for the sound of it ever since. I called Hetty Galt at her office at 8 o'clock exactly. She answered on the second ring because Hetty Galt was the kind of attorney who answered her own phone. I read her the letter. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Forward it to me. I will review it today." She said, "Dorian Vale has no custodial claim on Saurin." This was settled. She said, "This is a pressure tactic, not a legal one. But I want to read the letter before I say anything more definitive." I said, "All right." She said, "Are you holding up?" I said, "Yes, I was. Not because I was not frightened. I was." The specific and particular fear of a man who has been told his child could be used against him does not diminish with distance or time or legal documentation. It lives in its own place, separate from the rest of the nervous system's catalog, and it does not require much to wake it. 2 paragraphs from Dorian Vale were more than enough. But I was holding up because the person I had become over the past 2 years was not the person who had signed those divorce papers in a hospital room. That person had been so completely shaped by Dorian's hands that he did not know what his own voice sounded like at full volume. I had spent 2 years giving my nervous system new information, and the new information included the knowledge that I had survived the worst Dorian Vale could do, that I had walked out with my child, rebuilt from nothing, and made something that was entirely mine. I was not going to let a 2-paragraph letter undo 2 years of that work. I sent the letter to Hetty. Then I opened the shop and conditioned the morning delivery and arranged the window and smiled at my first customer of the day and sold them 2 bunches of garden roses and a pot of rosemary, and I kept going. I told Riven that evening, when he came by the shop at closing time on a route that had become established without either of us formally establishing it. He read the letter on his phone, where I had photographed it, and he did not say anything for a moment. When he looked up, his expression was controlled in a specific way I had not seen on his face before, where the control was clearly effortful. He said, "Do you have good legal representation?" I said, "Yes, Hetty Galt. She handled the original dissolution." He nodded. He said, "Is there anything you need?" I said, "I need it to be all right, and I know it probably will be, but I needed to tell someone." He said, "Thank you for telling me." He said it with such complete and specific sincerity that I had to look away for a moment. He said, "Can I walk you home?" I said, "Yes." He walked me to the door of the flat, and we stood in the light from the stairwell, and he said, "I want to say something, and I want to be clear that it does not require anything from you." I said, "All right." He said, "I am not going anywhere. Whatever Dorian Vale tries, however long this takes to resolve, I am not going anywhere." He said it without drama, without the weight of someone who expects to be thanked for a significant sacrifice. He said it the way he talked about coming back on Tuesdays, like a simple fact, like a matter of course. I reached up and put my hand on the side of his face, and he went very still and looked at me with his storm-gray eyes, and I said, "I know." And then I let my hand fall, and I went inside, and I heard him stand on the step for a moment before he walked back down the street. Hetty called the next morning. She had reviewed the letter and had made 3 calls. She said, "Dorian Vale has engaged an attorney in the family law division of a large firm." She said, "They have filed a notice of intent to review custodial terms, citing material change in circumstances." She said, "The material change they are citing is your new relationship." My stomach dropped. I said, "I am not in a relationship." She said, "They are claiming you are and that the new relationship represents a change in the domestic environment that could affect Saurin's stability. She said, "This is, as I suspected, a pressure tactic. A relationship is not grounds for custodial review, but they will attempt to make it one if they can paint your new partner as unstable or inappropriate." She said, "The fastest way to neutralize this is to be transparent about the nature of your connection to Riven Ashford and allow me to document that it is conducted appropriately." She said, "I will also be filing a countermotion noting that Dorian Vale has no custodial standing and that this filing represents harassment." I said, "Dorian Vale has been watching me. He knows Riven's name." She said, "Yes." "Which means he has had you surveilled, which is itself grounds for a restraining order application." She said, "Let me do my job, Cale." I said, "Yes." I said, "Hetty." She said, "You are going to be all right." I said, "I know." I told Riven everything that same afternoon. I told him clearly and completely and without apology, which was itself evidence of how far I had come, because 2 years ago I would have softened this information until it was unrecognizable, would have buried the frightening parts, would have made it easier for him to walk away, rather than risk the face he might make when he understood the full weight of it. I told him that Dorian had been watching, that he had named Riven specifically, that the legal tactic was designed to use the beginning of whatever we were to each other as a weapon against my custody of Saurin. Riven listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to help. Tell me how." I said, "Hetty is handling it." He said, "I understand. Tell me what I can do." I said, "Be honest with her when she contacts you." He said, "Of course." He said, "Cale?" I looked at him. He said, "He cannot have Saurin. That is not going to happen." He said it not as a comfort, but as a statement of fact, the way he stated all facts, with complete evenness and no decoration. Something shifted in my chest. Not the familiar clenching of fear, but something else, the unfamiliar and slightly dizzying sensation of being stood beside rather than stood in front of someone occupying the same position I was in rather than positioning themselves between me and the threat in a way that, however well-intentioned, returned me to the role of someone who needed protection, rather than someone fully capable of handling their own life. He was not trying to handle it for me. He was asking how to be useful. He was asking me to direct him rather than directing me. The difference, subtle as it was the difference between 2 years ago and now. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Always." It was the first time he had used that word, and we both heard it, and neither of us addressed it directly, but it sat in the air between us for a while with a specific warmth. The following week was taut with legal activity that Hetty managed with the efficiency and precision of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and took genuine personal exception to men who used family law as a harassment tool. She filed the counter motion and the restraining order application and prepared a documentation package of our original dissolution terms. She spoke to Riven's own attorney regarding Riven's character and professional standing, which was impeccable, and which she said undermined entirely Dorian's attempt to paint the domestic situation as unstable. And then Dorian himself appeared, not by letter this time, in person. He was standing outside the shop on a Thursday morning, which I believe he chose deliberately, knowing that Riven came on Thursdays. He was in a dark coat, and he looked exactly as I remembered him, precise and composed, and carrying the particular stillness of someone who has decided in advance how a situation will go. He was standing far enough from the door that he was not blocking it, which was its own message. He was there, but technically not interfering. It was the sort of calculated positioning I remembered from the first year of the marriage, before he understood I had learned to read him and stopped bothering with subtlety. I was standing at the window arranging a display when I saw him. My body registered him before my mind did, the familiar flood of cortisol, the tightening across the shoulders, the reflexive bracing. I stood with the flowers in my hands and breathed through it, counting the way, Doctor. Moray had taught me, and I watched my hands stop trembling after 6 counts, and I put the flowers down, and I went to the door. I opened it. I stood in the doorway. I said, I am going to call my attorney. He said, Kale. His voice was exactly as I remembered it. That particular register of controlled warmth, designed to make me feel that the sensible response was to lower my defenses. I want to talk to you. Just to talk. I said, everything you want to say to me can go through Hetty Galt. He took one step forward. He said, this does not need to be adversarial. We were bonded for 3 years. We have a child together. I only want to discuss what is best for Saurin. The sound of Saurin's name in Dorian Vale's mouth was not something I had planned for, and the rage that moved through me at the sound of it was clean and fierce and completely clear. It was not the old rage, muddied with fear and self-doubt and the habitual searching for what I had done to provoke things. It was the rage of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at and was not going to pretend otherwise. I said, Saurin is not a discussion you are entitled to have with me. I said, you have no custodial standing, which you know and your attorney knows. I said, your presence outside my shop this morning is going to be reported to my attorney and added to the restraining order application. I said, if you take one more step toward me, I am going to close this door and call the police. He stopped. He had not expected that voice. He had expected the voice I had in the apartment, the one that measured every syllable against the cost it might produce, the one that apologized ahead of the thing it was asking for. He had not encountered this one before, and I watched him recalibrate, watched the mask shift slightly, as he processed the fact that I was not going to fold. He said, you have changed. He said it the way people say something is wrong, not the way they say something has improved. I said, yes. And then I heard footsteps behind me on the pavement, coming from the direction of the car park where Riven always left his car on Thursday mornings. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on Dorian's face, watching him register whoever was approaching, watching his expression change as the information arrived. Riven came to stand beside me in the doorway. Not in front of me, not between me and Dorian, which would have placed me behind him and made me, once again, something to be shielded. Beside me, at my left shoulder, close enough that his arm was a solid, warm presence against mine. Close enough that his pheromones, the cedar and cold morning scent of a very controlled and very angry alpha, would carry across the few meters to where Dorian was standing. He did not say anything to Dorian. He looked at me and said quietly, I have the Thursday order in the car. Do you want it now, or shall I wait? As if Dorian Vale were not standing 10 feet away conducting psychological warfare. As if this were simply Thursday morning. I said, now is fine. Come in. I stepped back into the shop. Riven followed. The door closed. Behind the door, I heard Dorian's footsteps on the pavement after a moment, and then the sound of a car door, and then nothing. Riven set the standing order on the counter. I was standing with both hands flat on the workbench, and I was shaking very slightly. He did not reach for me. He went to the back kitchen and came back with 2 cups of tea and set one in front of me. Then he went to his usual position on the other side of the counter and wrapped both hands around his own cup and said, all right. Tell me what happened. I told him. All of it. Dorian's name from Saurin's mouth and the rage it produced, and the thing I had said at the door and the voice I had said it in. Riven listened. When I was finished, he said, that took extraordinary courage. I said, it took rage, I think, more than courage. He said, sometimes they are the same thing, organized differently. I looked at him across the counter in the morning light and the smell of flowers and tea, and I said, Riven. He looked at me with full attention, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. I said, I think I am falling in love with you, and I wanted to say it now rather than later, because I have done enough waiting in my life, and I would rather be honest about a thing that is true than careful about a thing that matters. My voice was steady. I was proud of it. He set his cup down. He came around the counter, slowly, giving me the full time to watch him coming, and he stopped in front of me with his hands loose at his sides, not reaching, not taking, simply there, simply present. He said, Kale, I have been falling in love with you since the 9th Thursday, when your son told me I could come back, he said, and I was already most of the way there before that. He said, "I just needed you to be ready." I reached for both his hands. He let me take them, and he held them with a care that was somehow both firm and light at once. We stood like that for a moment in the flower shop, morning light crossing the floor between us, and I thought about the first time I had seen him standing at the window, looking at the dahlia arrangement, and about every Thursday after that, and about the workroom floor and the open hands and the words "never, not me," and about the restful and specific quality of a silence shared with someone who does not need to fill it. And I thought, this is the new information. This is what I came through the other end for. Not just survival. This. He leaned his forehead against mine, the same way you lean toward something you have been looking forward to for a long time. He said, "Can I kiss you?" I said, "Yes." It was nothing like Dorian's kisses, which I understood now had always been possessive at their center, a claiming rather than a meeting. This was a meeting. It was careful and present and warm and unhurried, and it asked nothing that was not freely given, and when it was over, he kept his forehead against mine, and we stood breathing together in the quiet shop, and it was the safest I had felt inside my own body in as long as I could remember. He pulled back after a moment, and looked at me and said, "The anemone in the Thursday arrangement has been slightly off-center for the past 3 weeks. I had been too distracted to correct it." I laughed, which was not something I had expected to do in this particular moment, and the laugh was real and unguarded, and it surprised me by how good it felt coming out of my chest uncontrolled. I said, "I will fix it now." He said, "Take your time." Hetty's counter-motion was heard 3 weeks later. Dorian's legal team presented their case for custodial review, which the judge found, in Hetty's words when she called me afterward, to be thin and transparently retaliatory. The material change of circumstances argument was rejected on the grounds that Dorian Vale had no standing in Saurin's life, had made no attempt to establish any standing at any point in the 2 years since the dissolution, and that the nature of the change he cited, my new relationship, did not constitute grounds for review under the applicable statutes. The restraining order application was granted. Dorian Vale was required to maintain a distance of 200 meters from my shop, my home, my person, and Saurin at all times. Hetty said, "It is over." I said, "For now." She said, "Yes, for now." These things sometimes come in waves, but this wave is done. I went to collect Saurin from school that afternoon with Riven beside me, because he had asked if he could, and I had said yes. Saurin came out of the school gate at his usual speed, which was slightly faster than a walk but more purposeful than a run, and he saw us both, and his face changed in the way children's faces change when they register something good, simply and completely. He went to Riven first, which surprised me and did not surprise me at the same time, and Riven crouched to his level and said, "Good day." Saurin said, "We did paintings. I did one of the shop for Daddy." Riven said, "I would like to see it." Saurin said, "You can see it at dinner." He said it with complete confidence, as if the invitation to dinner was an established fact, rather than something that had not been arranged. I looked at Riven over Saurin's head. He looked at me with the expression I had learned entirely by now, the one that was quiet and warm and asking. I said, "You are apparently invited to dinner." He said, "Then I accept." We walked back to the shop through streets where autumn was beginning to make itself known in the color of the leaves and the quality of the light. The three of us on a pavement that was wide enough for it, Saurin between us talking about the painting and what he had used for the dahlia colors, and occasionally reaching up to take Riven's hand with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who has decided a person is trustworthy and sees no reason to make it complicated. Riven looked down at the small hand in his large one, with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Something open and slightly overwhelmed and very careful, like a man who has been given something valuable and is thinking about what it means to take proper care of it. I watched him and I thought, there it is. There is who he is, entirely. Dinner was soup and bread because it was a soup and bread kind of evening, and Saurin displayed his painting, which was remarkably accurate for a 4-year-old, and featured the shop sign in yellow, and the window arrangement in a confident purple that bore only a general resemblance to the actual flowers. Riven studied it with genuine attention, and asked Saurin several questions about the composition choices, which Saurin answered with the authority of someone who has thought carefully about everything they do and expects to be taken seriously. Riven took him seriously. Of course he did. After Saurin was in bed, Riven and I sat at the kitchen table with the last of the tea and the comfortable quiet that had become the signature of evenings spent together. The restraining order paperwork was on the table, signed and official, the final piece of the legal architecture Hetty had built around us. Riven looked at it for a moment. He said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Lighter." He nodded. I said, "Riven." He looked at me. I said, "I want you to know something." He waited, in the way he always waited, with complete and undemanding patience. I said, "For a long time I believed the damage was too deep, that I was too changed by what happened to be able to do this again, to want this again." He was still and quiet. I said, "You have been the new information. Every week, every Thursday, every time you chose the floor or chose beside me instead of in front of me or asked instead of assuming. Every single one of those things was new information, and my nervous system has been taking notes the entire time, and the notes say you are safe." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me that." He said, "I will keep earning it." He said it simply, without ceremony, as a statement of intention rather than a vow. He said, "Every day, I will keep earning it every day." I reached across the table and took his hand. He turned it over and held mine properly, the way you hold something you intend to keep. We sat like that in the quiet kitchen with the restraining order on the table and the sound of Saurin's breathing from down the hall and the street outside going about its evening business, and nothing needed to be said that had not been said, and nothing needed to happen that was not already happening, which was everything. 3 months later, on a Sunday morning that was gray and soft with early spring rain, Riven was in my kitchen making breakfast. I was sitting at the table with a cup of tea watching him, which was something I had discovered I could do without embarrassment, simply enjoy the fact of him in a space where he belonged. Saurin was on the floor nearby, conducting some complex architectural project with wooden blocks, providing a continuous narration of its progress to no one in particular. Riven turned from the stove and found me watching him, and he did not look away. He said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I am thinking I am happy." He said, "Good." He turned back to the stove. After a moment he said, "I am happy, too." He said it to the eggs rather than to me, which for reasons I would never fully be able to articulate was exactly the right way to say it. Not performed at me, just spoken into the room, true and uncomplicated, part of the same air we were both breathing. Saurin looked up from his blocks and said, "You are both happy." He said it as a confirmation of information he had gathered. Riven said, "Yes." Saurin said, "Good," and returned to the blocks. The breakfast was warm and unhurried. Afterward we walked to the market, all three of us, in the rain that had softened to something light and barely there. Saurin in his yellow coat holding Riven's hand on one side and mine on the other, and occasionally lifting his feet to be carried between us, which was a game he had invented and which we had both, without discussion, agreed to play indefinitely. The market smelled of wet stone and coffee and bread and early flowers, the first tulips of the season appearing at the stalls, and I stopped at one and bought 3 bunches, yellow and cream and a deep and particular violet that reminded me of something I could not place immediately and then placed with a warm surprise. It was the color of the first arrangement Riven had stood at the window looking at, the dahlias and the anemone against the dark moss, on the Thursday 9 months ago, when he had come in off the street and not quite been able to leave. I handed him one of the bunches. He looked at it, and I watched the recognition cross his face, the same quiet and specific recognition he gave to things that mattered to him. He said, "Is this deliberate?" I said, "Completely." He said nothing else. He held the flowers carefully at his side as we walked through the market in the rain, and Saurin swung between us, and I thought about botanical gardens and botanical watercolors and what it means to stand in front of something and feel, with complete and sudden certainty, that you are looking at something that belongs in your life. I had believed that once before, and been wrong in ways that cost me dearly. I had been right to be careful after that. I had been right to gather evidence slowly and give my nervous system the time it needed and insist on the pace that felt safe, rather than the pace that felt urgent. But I was not wrong now. I knew the difference. I had learned it through 3 years of terrible schooling, and 2 years of patient rebuilding, and 9 months of Thursday arrangements, and 1 workroom floor, and 100 small proofs accumulated one after another, until the weight of them was undeniable. I was not wrong now. Riven looked over Saurin's head and caught me looking at him and said nothing, just held my gaze with the quiet steadiness that was the most characteristically himself thing about him, and I thought, the nervous system is loyal. It protects you using the best information it has. And all the information I had now, every data point in the careful and particular archive of the past 9 months, said the same thing. Safe, 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 safe. And I believed it, entirely, standing in the rain in the market with flowers in both our hands and Saurin between us, believed it with the full weight of who I had become, which was a man who had been broken and had built himself again from the inside out, and who knew the difference now between a raised hand and a gentle one, between a silence used as a weapon and a silence used as a room, between someone who catalogues your preferences to own them and someone who simply listens, remembers, shows up on Tuesday with almond croissants, goes to his knees in a cold workroom without being asked, and says, in the quietest possible voice, the truest possible thing. Never. Not me. If you enjoyed today's story, please like it and share it with someone who needed to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about love that earns itself and hearts that find their way home. Drop a comment telling us where you are watching from and which moment in the story meant the most to you. I read every single comment, and they mean more than you know, my beautiful angels. Let us meet again in the next story. Until then, take good care of yourselves, because you deserve exactly the kind of love that makes you feel safe.